Somewhere in modern-day Ukraine, Romania, and Moldova, long before the pyramids of Egypt were a single architect's dream, long before Stonehenge was anything more than an open field in Britain, long before the Bronze Age had even begun, tens of thousands of people were doing something that no one had ever done before in the history of our species. They were building cities. Not villages, not camps, not seasonal gathering places. Cities. Massive, planned, intentional urban settlements, some housing up to 15, maybe even 20,000 people at a time. With concentric rings of streets, with public spaces, with what appears to be sophisticated governance, organized labor, and coordinated trade networks stretching hundreds of miles in every direction. And then, at the height of their power, they burned it all down. Every single settlement, deliberately, methodically, repeatedly, for over 1,000 years. This is the story of the Cucuteni Trypillia culture, the forgotten mega-civilization of prehistoric Europe. And I promise you, by the time this video is over, you will never look at the ancient world the same way again. Let's start at the beginning, not the beginning of the civilization itself, but the beginning of our knowledge of it. The year is 1884. A Romanian archaeologist named Theodore Burada is excavating a site near the village of Cucuteni in the Moldavia region of northeastern Romania. He's not looking for anything in particular. Romania at this point is a young nation, only declared fully independent from the Ottoman Empire just a few years earlier in 1877, and the country is in the middle of a kind of cultural and intellectual awakening. People want to know who they are, where they came from, what came before. So Burada digs. And what he finds is extraordinary. Beneath the soil, he uncovers fragments of painted pottery, unlike anything previously recorded in European prehistory. Not rough utilitarian clay pots, not simple decorated jars. These are ceramics of staggering sophistication, covered in complex, swirling geometric designs in bold reds, blacks, and whites. Spirals within spirals, interlocking diamonds, serpentine lines that seem to move even when the pottery is still. He also finds the remains of burned structures. And figurines, small clay statuettes depicting human forms, primarily women, with exaggerated features that suggest ritual or religious significance. But Burda's excavation is just a beginning. The real breakthrough comes in 1896, when Vikenty Kvoika, a Czech archaeologist working in the Russian Empire, begins excavating at the site of Trypillia, near Kiev in modern Ukraine. He finds the same kinds of artifacts, the same painted pottery, the same burned structures, the same figurines. Two separate discoveries, hundreds of miles apart, clearly the same culture. And here we arrive at one of the first layers of this story's complexity, a complexity that will recur throughout our entire video. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture sits at the intersection of multiple modern nations, Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Each nation has, at various points in history, had reasons to claim this ancient culture as their own. Romanian nationalists in the early 20th century saw the Cucuteni culture as Proto-Romanian. Soviet archaeologists later tried to incorporate Trypillia into a grand narrative of Slavic origins. The science, frustratingly, doesn't care about modern borders. These people predated every single modern ethnic and national category by thousands of years. They were neither Romanian, nor Ukrainian, nor Slavic, nor anything else we have a word for today. They were something entirely their own. But in the decades following those first discoveries, the Cucuteni Trypillia culture remained a relatively obscure footnote in European prehistory. Part of this was geopolitical. The regions where this culture flourished spent much of the 20th century behind the Iron Curtain, where Western archaeologists had limited access to sites, and Soviet-era research was often conducted in languages and published in journals that Western academics rarely read. Part of it was simply a matter of what captures popular imagination. Egypt has the pyramids, Greece has the Parthenon, Rome has the Colosseum. These are monuments that survived, enormous, photogenic, impossible to ignore. The Cucuteni Trypillia people left no stone monuments. Their buildings were made of wood and clay. They burned their settlements at regular intervals. What they left behind was mostly underground, invisible from the surface, waiting to be found. But beginning in the 1990s, As the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine and Moldova became independent nations with their own archaeological institutions and their own international connections, the pace of research accelerated dramatically. Aerial photography revealed crop marks indicating enormous circular settlements that no one had previously mapped. Magnetometry surveys, a technique that uses subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field to detect buried structures without digging, revealed the floor plans of hundreds, then thousands of individual houses within those settlements. And what those floor plans revealed forced archaeologists to fundamentally reconsider everything they thought they knew about prehistoric Europe. I want you to picture something. It's approximately 3,800 BCE. That's almost 6,000 years ago. The Egyptian Old Kingdom, the era of pyramid building, won't begin for another 800 years. The Minoan civilization on Crete is still over 1,000 years away. Stonehenge is being built right now, as we speak, but it's just the initial earthwork phase. The famous stone circle won't be erected for another 1,000 years. Writing has not been invented yet anywhere on Earth. And here, on the fertile plains between the Carpathian Mountains and the Dnieper River, somewhere in what is now central Ukraine, you are walking through the outskirts of a city. No, let me be more specific. You are walking through the outskirts of Talianki, a Cucuteni Trypillia megasite that covers approximately 450 hectares. That's roughly 1,100 acres, or about the size of modern-day central Paris within the inner ring roads. And inside this settlement, packed into concentric rings of houses arranged in deliberate, planned patterns, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people are living their lives. Let that sink in for a moment. We are talking about a population density and a settlement size that, in the ancient world, is essentially unprecedented at this date, not just in Europe, but anywhere on Earth. Because the earliest Mesopotamian cities, Uruk, Eridu, Ur, are often cited as humanity's first cities, and they are, in terms of what we typically mean by city, writing, taxation, state bureaucracy. But Uruk, in its early phases around 3,500 BCE, had somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people. Impressive, but in the same broad league as Talianki. And Uruk had a 300 to 500 year head start in terms of settlement size. Talianki is not alone. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites form a cluster, primarily in the Uman region of central Ukraine. Let me list some of the largest. Talianki, approximately 450 hectares, estimated 15,000, 21,000 people. Maidanetska, approximately 250 hectares, estimated 10,000, 12,000 people. Dobrovol'dy, approximately 250 hectares, estimated 10,000 people. Vesely Kut, approximately 150 hectares. Nebelivka, approximately 238 hectares. These are not all contemporary with each other. They appear to have risen and fallen in sequence, which we'll discuss later. But each of them represents a peak of concentrated human habitation that has no parallel in prehistoric Europe. Now, I need to be careful here, because this is one of those topics where the word city generates enormous academic controversy, and I think that controversy is actually really important and worth spending a few minutes on. When archaeologists talk about cities, they're typically using a specific definition developed largely from the study of Mesopotamia and Egypt, definitions that emphasize things like writing, monumental architecture, specialized labor, taxation, and state-level political organization. By those definitions, the Cucuteni Trypillia megasites probably weren't cities. We have no evidence of writing. We have limited evidence of strong political hierarchy. We don't have palaces or temples that clearly dominate the settlement layout the way they do in Mesopotamian cities. So some archaeologists prefer terms like megasites or proto-urban settlements, a kind of academic hedge that acknowledges the extraordinary size of these places while reserving judgment on whether they had the social and political complexity we associate with true urbanism. But here's the thing that I find fascinating about this debate. It might be telling us something profound not about the limits of the Cucuteni Trypillia people, but about the limits of our definitions. What if urbanism doesn't have to look like Mesopotamia? What if large-scale collective human organization can take forms that don't involve writing, don't involve kings, don't involve monumental temples, and can still be a legitimate, sophisticated, functional expression of human social complexity. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites might force us to ask, what is a city really? Is it defined by its institutions or by its people, by its bureaucracy or by its scale, by what it records or by what it builds? These are not idle philosophical questions. They matter for how we understand human history, because the story we tell about cities is also the story we tell about civilization itself, and about which peoples and cultures we consider to be civilized. Let me describe what we actually know about the physical layout of these megasites, because it is genuinely astonishing. The defining feature of a Cucuteni Trypillia megasite, as revealed by the magnetometry surveys, is its concentric ring structure. Houses are not scattered randomly. They are arranged in rings, sometimes 2 rings, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 or more, forming enormous circles around a central open space. At Nebelivka, which has been particularly well studied by a joint Ukrainian-British team led by archaeologist John Chapman in recent years, the magnetometry survey revealed not just the outer ring structure, but the internal layout in extraordinary detail. The settlement had at least 3 to 4 concentric rings of houses. The houses themselves are large, typically 60 to 120 square meters of floor space, sometimes larger. By comparison, the average Roman apartment insula in classical Rome offered perhaps 25 to 35 square meters per family. These Cucuteni Trypillia houses are substantial structures. The houses are oriented radially, that is, they point toward the center of the settlement like spokes on a wheel, with their long axes aligned perpendicular to the ring. This creates a remarkably regular, almost geometric townscape. Between the rings, there are pathways and open spaces. The central area, which can be enormous, covering many hectares, appears to have been left deliberately open. What was the center for? We don't know for certain. No massive central building has been identified at most megasites. The center might have been used for communal agricultural activities, corralling livestock, storing grain. It might have been a ritual space. It might have been a marketplace. It might have been all 3 at different times. At Nebelivka specifically, the research team identified what they called an assembly house, a structure significantly larger than typical residential buildings, located in a prominent position within the settlement. This assembly house, if their interpretation is correct, might have served as a communal meeting place, somewhere the community came together to make decisions, conduct ceremonies, resolve disputes. If true, this is a fascinating piece of evidence. A community of potentially 10 to 15,000 people apparently maintaining some form of collective governance without a palace, without a king, without an obvious ruling class. This brings us to one of the most debated questions in Cucuteni Trypillia scholarship. How did they govern themselves? Here's a general rule of thumb in archaeology. If a society had powerful rulers, kings, chiefs, priests with enormous authority, their burials usually show it. You find graves of extraordinary richness: gold, silver, weapons, exotic goods from far away, sacrificed servants. Think of the royal cemetery at Ur in Mesopotamia, where queens were buried with dozens of attendants who were killed to accompany them in death. Think of Egyptian pharaoh tombs. Think of the Bronze Age warrior burials of Northern Europe, with their elaborate weaponry. The Cucuteni Trypillia burials are nothing like that. We actually have relatively few burials from the Cucuteni Trypillia culture, which is itself an interesting puzzle, given the size of the settlements. Where are the cemeteries? The evidence suggests various mortuary practices including cremation, excarnation, leaving bodies to decompose above ground before collecting the bones, and possibly interment in structures that were then burned. But the burials we do have are, by and large, relatively uniform. Some individuals are buried with more grave goods than others, suggesting some degree of social differentiation, perhaps of status, perhaps of age, perhaps of specialized roles. But there are no obviously kingly burials. No graves so astronomically richer than the others that they cry out ruler the way Bronze Age chieftain burials do. This has led some researchers to propose that Cucuteni Trypillia society was relatively egalitarian, what archaeologists sometimes call a heterarchical society, as opposed to a hierarchical one. In a hierarchy, power flows from the top down. The king commands the nobles who command the peasants. In a heterarchy, power is distributed more laterally. Different individuals or groups have authority in different domains without one necessarily being above the others. A council of elders, perhaps, or clan leaders who each have authority within their own kinship group but no authority over others. The scholar David Wengrow, along with the late David Graeber, in their remarkable book The Dawn of Everything, argued that the Cucuteni Trypillia megasites represent perhaps the most compelling archaeological evidence we have for the possibility of large-scale human social complexity without hierarchy, cities without kings. This is a deeply provocative idea, and not everyone agrees with it. Some archaeologists argue that the evidence for egalitarianism is simply the absence of evidence for hierarchy, which is not the same thing. We may be missing the markers of elite status because the Cucuteni Trypillia people expressed power in ways that don't preserve well in the archaeological record. Feasting, for example, the ability to host enormous communal banquets, is a major source of political power in many pre-state societies. But feasting leaves behind only food debris and animal bones. Oratory and knowledge, knowing the right rituals, the right stories, the right astronomical observations, confer enormous power in many traditional societies, but leave no direct archaeological trace. The honest answer is, we don't know. And that uncertainty is itself significant. What we can say is that the Cucuteni Trypillia megasites were organized and maintained over long periods, sometimes centuries, by communities of thousands of people. That organization required something, some form of planning, coordination, and decision-making. Whether that something was a ruling class, a council, a consensus-based assembly, or something else entirely that we don't yet have a name for, that remains one of the great open questions. Let me tell you something else about these settlements that is deeply puzzling and that bears directly on the question of governance. The houses within a megasite were not all built at the same time. The magnetometry surveys suggest that construction was phased, new rings were added as the population grew, and individual houses within rings were periodically replaced. This implies ongoing, active community management of the built environment. Somebody, or some process, was coordinating the placement of new houses to maintain the ring structure, to preserve the radial orientation, to keep the central space open. That's not what happens if people just build wherever they want. Random settlement growth produces dense, organic, irregular patterns. Think of the medieval town cores of many European cities, which grew without central planning and are famously labyrinthine. The regularity of the Cucuteni Trypillia megasites implies intentionality. Community-wide agreement about how the space should be organized, and that community-wide agreement had to be enforced or maintained somehow. How? We genuinely don't know. But the fact that it persisted across generations, across centuries, across populations of thousands of people tells us something profound about the social capabilities of these communities. I want to spend some time with the art because I think it's the most direct window we have into the minds and spiritual lives of these people. And it is, by any standard, remarkable. Cucuteni Trypillia pottery is immediately recognizable. Once you've seen it, you never forget it. The designs are painted in slip, a liquid clay mixture, before firing, in combinations of red, black, white, and sometimes orange or yellow. And the designs themselves are dominated by spirals. Spirals everywhere. Double spirals. Counter-rotating spirals. Spirals connected by flowing lines to form continuous meanders. Spirals nested inside other spirals. Spirals that, when you follow their path, seem to dissolve into infinity. What did the spiral mean to these people? We can only speculate. In many world cultures, spirals are associated with the movement of celestial bodies, the sun's apparent journey through the year, the cycling of seasons. They're associated with water, the coiling of rivers, the patterns of waves. They're associated with life force itself, the unfurling of a plant from a seed, the growth of a shell, the pattern of a whirlpool. The spiral is one of nature's fundamental forms. It appears in galaxy arms, in hurricane patterns, in DNA, in snail shells, in the curve of a ram's horn. Perhaps the Cucuteni Trypillia artists were drawing on this deep resonance, painting vessels not just with beautiful decoration, but with symbols of the fundamental patterns underlying reality. What's remarkable about the pottery is not just the designs, but the technical skill required to produce them. These are not crude attempts. They display a mastery of clay preparation, slip mixing, firing temperature control, and decorative technique that speaks to generations of accumulated craft knowledge. Each pot is a small, portable masterpiece, and they made them by the thousands. At every excavated site, pottery sherds are one of the most abundant finds. These people were not saving their best pottery for special occasions. They were using elaborate, beautifully decorated ceramics in daily life, eating, cooking, storing grain, fermenting alcohol, we have evidence of this, ritually depositing offerings. Now let's talk about the figurines, because they raise some of the most complex and contested questions in the field. Among the most abundant small finds from Cucuteni Trypillia sites are clay figurines, the vast majority of which represent the female form. They range from a few centimeters to perhaps 20 or 30 centimeters in height. Some are highly schematized, little more than a pinched clay suggestion of hips and shoulders. Others are extraordinarily detailed, with carefully modeled facial features, hairstyles, patterned garments incised into the clay surface, elaborate decorative motifs. Some of these figurines are found in what appear to be ritual contexts, carefully deposited in specific locations within houses, sometimes in groups suggesting a kind of domestic shrine or altar. Others are found broken, in debris layers, suggesting they were used and discarded. Some show traces of burning, separate from the burning of the buildings, suggesting they may have been intentionally burned as part of a ritual act. What were they for? Here the debate gets heated. Early 20th century archaeologists, working within a theoretical framework developed largely by the Lithuanian-American archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, interpreted these figurines as evidence of a prehistoric goddess-worshipping culture. In Gimbutas's vision, the people of prehistoric southeastern Europe, including the Cucuteni Trypillia, were devotees of a great goddess, a mother deity of fertility and regeneration, who presided over a peaceful, egalitarian, matriarchal civilization before being swept away by violent, patriarchal, sky god-worshipping Indo-European invaders from the steppe. This is an enormously appealing story. It has the shape of myth, paradise lost, the fall from grace, the original sin of patriarchy. Gimbutas was a brilliant, charismatic scholar, and her ideas captivated a generation of feminists, neo-pagans, and people hungry for a prehistoric alternative to the relentlessly male-dominated ancient world most people learn about in school. But modern archaeologists are, by and large, quite skeptical of the Gimbutas model. Not because the idea of prehistoric goddess worship is inherently absurd, it isn't, but because the evidence simply doesn't support the specific, sweeping claims Gimbutas made. The figurines are predominantly female, yes, but there are also male figurines, animal figurines, and figurines that are ambiguous or asexual. The assumption that female figurines automatically represent a goddess, rather than, say, representations of ancestors, or of specific women, or of magical dolls used in ritual healing, or of toys, or of any number of other possibilities, that assumption requires a conceptual leap the evidence doesn't support. More broadly, the peaceful, matriarchal interpretation of Cucuteni Trypillia society sits uneasily with some of the physical evidence. We have signs of violent death in the skeletal record. We have fortified settlements, ditches, and palisades that suggest fear of attack. We have the burning of entire settlements, which might be peaceful and ritual, or might be conquest. More on that later. The truth is probably somewhere between Gimbutas's poetic vision and the skeptic's coldest dismissals. These people clearly had a rich spiritual life. The figurines, the elaborate pottery, the decorated houses, all of it speaks to a culture in which the sacred and the aesthetic were deeply intertwined with daily life. Whether they worshipped a goddess, multiple deities, ancestor spirits, nature forces, or something else entirely for which we don't have a good Western category, we simply can't say with certainty. But we should resist the temptation to fill our ignorance with the nearest romantic fantasy. These were real people, with real complexities. They deserve better than to be flattened into symbols for modern ideological projects, whether nationalist, feminist, pagan, or anything else. To understand why the Cucuteni Trypillia megasites were possible, why tens of thousands of people could live in one place, you have to understand their economy. And it was, for its time, extraordinarily sophisticated. The foundation was agriculture. The Cucuteni Trypillia people were farmers in the fullest sense. They cultivated wheat, barley, millet, peas, beans, and lentils. They kept domestic cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. They hunted wild animals, deer, boar, aurochs, to supplement their diet. They gathered wild plants. They fished rivers and lakes. The region they inhabited, the forest steppe zone of what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and northeastern Romania, is one of the most naturally fertile agricultural environments on Earth. The soil is a dark, loamy mixture called chernozem, black earth in Russian, extraordinarily rich in organic matter and minerals. Ukraine today is one of the world's great agricultural breadbaskets, producing enormous quantities of wheat and other cereals. 6,000 years ago, the land was even richer, virgin soil, unexhausted by millennia of intensive farming. With good land and good farming practices, this region could theoretically support large populations. But farming alone doesn't explain cities. You also need a surplus. Enough food produced above and beyond what the farmers themselves consume to feed specialists. Potters, weavers, woodworkers, traders, ritual specialists, community leaders. The evidence suggests the Cucuteni Trypillia people were producing significant agricultural surpluses. We find large storage vessels at megasites, ceramic containers capable of holding hundreds of liters of grain. We find evidence of large communal storage facilities. And we find evidence of trade. The trade evidence is particularly fascinating. Cucuteni Trypillia artifacts, particularly the distinctive painted pottery, have been found at sites far outside the core territory of the culture. And conversely, we find at Cucuteni Trypillia sites materials that could only have come from distant regions. Flint from the Dniester and Bug river valleys, copper from the Balkans and the Carpathian Mountains, obsidian from volcanic sources in the Carpathians and even the Aegean, shells from the Black Sea coast. These materials moved through exchange networks spanning hundreds of miles. The copper is particularly significant. The Cucuteni Trypillia people were among the earliest in Europe to work with copper, producing ornaments, tools, and small implements from the metal. They were doing this at roughly the same time as the earliest Copper Age developments in the Balkans, the famous Varna Cemetery in Bulgaria, for example, where some of the world's earliest gold and copper artifacts have been found, dates to the same general period. This places the Cucuteni Trypillia culture squarely within a broader Copper Age or Chalcolithic world that was, at the time, the cutting edge of technological development. They weren't isolated backwaters. They were participants in a continent-spanning network of innovation and exchange. What did they trade? What did they offer in exchange for the copper and obsidian and shells they received? Almost certainly agricultural products, grain probably, and perhaps animal products like leather, wool, and tallow. Perhaps also their remarkable pottery, which was distinctive enough to be immediately recognizable as Cucuteni Trypillia wherever it traveled. And perhaps other goods that don't preserve in the archaeological record, textiles, for example. We have indirect evidence that the Cucuteni Trypillia people kept sheep specifically for wool, and there are ceramic tools that suggest weaving, but actual textiles almost never survive. There's one more aspect of the Cucuteni Trypillia economy that I want to discuss, because it tells us something important about how these communities actually functioned on a day-to-day level. At the megasite of Nebelivka, the British-Ukrainian research team conducted a detailed analysis of pottery distribution across the settlement. What they found was striking. Different neighborhoods within the settlement had different pottery styles. Not dramatically different, all of it was recognizably Cucuteni Trypillia, but subtly different in terms of decorative patterns and manufacturing techniques. This suggests that different groups within the megasite, perhaps extended kinship groups, perhaps people who had migrated from different source communities, maintained their own distinct craft traditions even while living together in the same large settlement. The megasite was not a homogenized mass of interchangeable individuals. It was a community of communities, a coalition of groups who had come together to live in one place while retaining their own identities. This model of the megasite as a coalition, rather than a unified polity, has important implications for the governance question we discussed earlier. It suggests that the megasite might have been organized not through centralized authority, but through negotiated cooperation between semi-autonomous groups, a confederation rather than a kingdom. Let me take you inside a Cucuteni Trypillia house. Because the houses are one of the most remarkable things about this culture, and they tell us an enormous amount about the everyday lives of real people. A typical Cucuteni Trypillia house from the Megasite period is a long rectangular structure. Its frame was constructed from timber posts, large wooden beams driven into the ground or set in foundation trenches. The walls were made by filling a framework of woven branches with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung, a technique called wattle and daub, which is surprisingly durable and excellent at regulating temperature. The roof was likely thatched. The floor was a clay platform, often remarkably level and smooth, sometimes plastered and burnished to a hard finish. Some floors have been found with traces of painted decoration, geometric patterns similar to those on the pottery, extending the artistic sensibility of these people even to the surfaces they walked on. Inside, the space was organized, not rigidly, but meaningfully. The houses typically had distinct zones: a cooking area with an oven or hearth, a sleeping and resting area, a working area where pottery was made, textiles woven, grain ground, a storage area with large ceramic vessels for grain and other provisions. We find grinding stones, flat stones used to process grain into flour, almost universally. Grain processing was a daily, labor-intensive activity. Someone in that house, almost certainly a woman based on ethnographic parallels, though we can't be certain, spent significant portions of every day grinding grain. We find loom weights, small clay or stone weights used to keep warp threads taut on an upright loom. Weaving was happening in these houses. Cloth was being made. We find animal bones, cattle, pig, sheep, goat, deer, representing the remains of meals. We find freshwater shellfish. We find fish bones. We find berry seeds and nutshells from gathered plant foods. And we find always pottery. Beautiful painted pottery in use for cooking, serving, storing, and ritual. Here's something I find profoundly moving about these houses. We know what they looked like when they burned. Because the deliberate burning of houses, which we'll discuss in much more detail shortly, preserved things in extraordinary ways. When a building burns and its clay walls collapse, the heat from the burning timber can actually bake the clay, turning the wall material into something approaching ceramic. The result is that the collapsed walls of burned Cucuteni Trypillia houses sometimes preserve the impressions of the wattle framework, the texture of the clay, and occasionally traces of painted decoration that would never have survived in an unburned structure. More importantly, the burning often preserved the house's contents in situ, exactly where they were at the moment of destruction. Pottery vessels still sitting on shelves, grinding stones still in place on the floor, ovens still containing the ash of their last fires, animal bones from the last meal, grain still in its storage vessels. Walking through the excavation of a burned Cucuteni Trypillia house is, in a very literal sense, walking through the last moment of someone's domestic life. A life interrupted, preserved in fire, and uncovered thousands of years later by archaeologists with brushes and trowels. I want to give those people their humanity, not as symbols of a lost golden age or as proof of some academic theory about social complexity. As people, as humans who woke up in the morning and ground their grain and fed their children and argued with their neighbors and sat by the fire at night telling stories. We don't know their names, we don't know their language, we can't hear their voices, but we can see where they put their grinding stones. And now we come to it, the thing that makes the Cucuteni Trypillia culture truly unforgettable. The thing that has haunted archaeologists for over a century, and that, in my view, represents one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the study of human prehistory. Every settlement they built, they eventually burned. Not some of them, not most of them, all of them. Every excavated Cucuteni Trypillia site shows evidence of deliberate burning. The entire community, every house, every structure, burned to the ground, at regular intervals, over and over again, for the entire 1,500-year span of the culture's existence. Let me be precise about what deliberate means here because the evidence is quite strong. When buildings burn accidentally, in fires caused by cooking accidents, lightning strikes, or the kind of random conflagrations that occasionally swept through pre-modern cities, the burning pattern is uneven. Some buildings burn completely, others are only partially damaged, others are untouched. The fire spreads from a source and is stopped or diverted by wind, fire breaks, or luck. And when people flee an accidental fire, they take their valuables with them. The archaeological footprint of an accidental fire includes a chaotic, uneven burn pattern and relatively empty buildings. The Cucuteni Trypillia burn events look completely different. The burning is systematic. Houses across an entire settlement show evidence of fire at approximately the same time. The burning appears to have been started simultaneously or in a coordinated sequence across the whole site, not spreading from a single source. And, this is the clincher, the burned houses contain their contents intact. The pottery is still on the shelves. The grain is still in the storage vessels. The tools are still on the floors. Everything is where it belongs, because nobody removed it before the fire. Either the inhabitants left very quickly with no time to save anything, unlikely in a coordinated community-wide event, or they deliberately left everything behind. Moreover, some structures appear to have been specially prepared for burning. In some cases, archaeologists find evidence that additional fuel, logs, brush, was added to buildings beyond what the building itself contained, as if to ensure thorough combustion. Some buildings appear to have had their entrances blocked before burning, creating a sealed chamber effect. This is not a disaster. This is a ritual. But what kind of ritual? What purpose could it possibly serve to build a settlement of hundreds or thousands of houses, live in it for perhaps 50 to 80 years, and then burn the whole thing to the ground and start over somewhere new? This is the question that has generated more debate, more speculation, and more genuinely fascinating scholarly argument than almost any other question in European prehistory. Let me walk you through the main competing theories. Theory 1. Agricultural necessity. This is probably the most sober, pragmatic explanation. The Cucuteni Trypillia people practiced what is sometimes called slash and burn, or swidden agriculture, a farming technique in which forest or grassland is burned to create fertile fields, which are then farmed for a few years until the soil is exhausted, then abandoned, while new land is burned elsewhere. The community would need to periodically move to follow the fertile land. In this view, the burning of settlements is simply a practical consequence of agricultural logic. When the land around a settlement was exhausted, the community moved on, and burning the old settlement, with all its organic refuse, its accumulations of human and animal waste, the parasites and disease organisms that inevitably build up in any long-occupied human settlement, was a form of sanitation, a reset, a clearing of the slate. This theory has real merit. We do see evidence of agricultural expansion in the Cucuteni Trypillia territory, with settlements appearing in previously unoccupied areas and the abandonment of old settlement zones. The timing of site abandonment does seem to correlate in some cases with evidence of soil exhaustion in the surrounding landscape, but it doesn't fully explain the deliberateness of the burning, the sealed buildings, the intact contents, the coordinated simultaneity. Practical sanitation doesn't require leaving your pottery in place. Theory 2. Periodic ritual renewal. A more symbolically rich interpretation sees the burning as a ritual act of regeneration. Many of the world's cultures have concepts of cyclical renewal, the idea that things must die in order to be reborn, that endings are necessary for new beginnings, that the destruction of the old makes space for the new. Think of the phoenix. Think of Shiva the destroyer in Hindu cosmology. Think of the Norse concept of Ragnarok followed by a new world. In this view, the Cucuteni Trypillia people may have had a cosmological framework in which the periodic destruction and renewal of their built environment was not a tragedy but a necessity, a sacred act that maintained the proper order of the universe, ensured the continued fertility of the land, and perhaps honored the spirits of the dead by sending their earthly goods up in smoke. The intact contents of the burned buildings fit this interpretation well. If you're burning a house as a ritual offering, sending it to another realm, you don't take the offerings out first. You send everything. Some archaeologists note parallels with practices in other cultures. In some Native American traditions, the belongings of the dead were burned to release them for use in the afterlife. In some Hindu traditions, a deceased person's possessions are disposed of after death to prevent the spirit from lingering. These are not the same thing as Cucuteni Trypillia house burning, but they suggest that the burning of material possessions as part of a transition or ending is a widespread human impulse. Theory 3. Political or social reset. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive but intellectually exciting theory. Some scholars, including again David Wengrow and David Graeber in The Dawn of Everything, have suggested that the periodic burning might represent a form of deliberate social deconstruction, a community-wide practice of preventing the accumulation of wealth, status, and power by periodically destroying all material possessions. Think about it this way. In most societies, wealth accumulates over generations. A successful family passes its house, its tools, its livestock, its social connections to its children, who pass them to their children, who pass them onward. Over time, small initial differences in wealth become larger and larger. Inequalities compound. What if the Cucuteni Trypillia people recognized this dynamic and had a cultural mechanism for counteracting it? What if the periodic burning, destroying everything, starting fresh, on a completely level playing field, was their way of preventing the emergence of a permanent wealthy class? This would explain both the regularity of the burning, it happened on a schedule, not just when it was agriculturally convenient, and the community-wide scope of it, everyone burns, not just the poor people. It would also fit with the relatively egalitarian burial record we discussed earlier. Critics point out that this is speculative and perhaps overly modern in its political framing. But it's not without precedent. The potlatch tradition among Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples, in which chiefs demonstrated their status not by accumulating wealth, but by giving it all away in enormous public feasts, shows that cultures have developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing the social dangers of wealth accumulation. Theory 4. Warfare and abandonment. The most grim interpretation is simply that these settlements were burned by enemies. Conquest. Raiding. The deliberate destruction of a community's home by hostile outsiders. This can't be entirely ruled out, particularly for some sites and some time periods. We do have evidence of violence at some Cucuteni Trypillia sites, skeletal remains showing signs of violent death, fortification features suggesting fear of attack. And as we'll discuss in the next section, the Cucuteni Trypillia world was not peaceful. It existed within a broader prehistoric landscape where conflict was real. But conquest doesn't explain the regular, scheduled, repeating pattern of burning across all sites over 15 centuries. Conquering armies don't follow convenient 50-year schedules. And conquering armies don't typically leave the buildings full of intact goods. They loot first, then burn. My own view, and I'll be honest that this is partly personal, is that the truth is probably a combination of the first two theories. Agricultural necessity fused with ritual significance into something inseparable. These were people for whom the practical and the sacred were not separate categories. Moving on when the land was exhausted was both necessary and ritually appropriate. The fire that cleansed the old settlement was both practical sanitation and sacred renewal. The act of leaving everything behind was both logistically simple, you don't have to carry it, and symbolically powerful. You're really leaving, you're starting fresh, the old place is truly gone. The burning was the price of continuity. The community died in fire so that it could be reborn somewhere new. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture did not exist in isolation. It was one player, albeit an extraordinary one, in a complex, dynamic world of interacting prehistoric cultures across Europe and Western Eurasia. Understanding their neighbors is essential to understanding both their rise and their eventual disappearance. To their west, across the Carpathian Mountains, lay the cultures of the Balkans, including the remarkable Varna culture in what is now Bulgaria, where the world's earliest known gold artifacts were buried in a cemetery around 4500 BCE. The Cucuteni Trypillia people were in contact with these Balkan cultures, importing copper and other materials. To their northwest lay the cultures of Central and Northern Europe, the early farmers who were beginning to spread across the continent from Anatolia via the Danube corridor, bringing their agricultural package with them. Cucuteni Trypillia pottery designs show some stylistic parallels with linear band ceramic (LBK) cultures to the west, suggesting cultural contact. To their south lay the Black Sea coast and, beyond it, Anatolia and the broader Near East. The Black Sea trade routes were ancient even by Cucuteni Trypillia times, and the culture was clearly embedded in a broader network of exchange stretching in that direction. But it's to the east that the most consequential story lies. East of the Cucuteni Trypillia territory lay the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grassland sea stretching from the Danube to the Altai Mountains. For much of human prehistory, this steppe was sparsely populated by hunter-gatherers and early herders who lived in small, mobile groups. But around 4500 to 4000 BCE, something began changing on the steppe. People there, the ancestors of what archaeologists call the Yamnaya culture, were increasingly adopting horse riding and herding as a primary subsistence strategy. They were developing wagons. They were becoming, in short, the world's first true pastoral nomads. Mobile, fast-moving, organized around kinship and cattle raiding rather than settled farming. The relationship between the Cucuteni Trypillia culture and the steppe peoples to their east is one of the most intensively studied and contested topics in prehistoric Eurasian archaeology. For a long time, the conventional narrative was one of conflict and eventual conquest. The steppe nomads swept westward, destroying the settled farming cultures they encountered, and the collapse of Cucuteni Trypillia was a direct result of this violent intrusion. Maria Gimbutas was the most eloquent proponent of this narrative. Her Kurgan hypothesis, named for the burial mounds or kurgans of the steppe peoples, proposed that the pastoral nomads were not just economically different from the Cucuteni Trypillia farmers, but culturally antithetical, patriarchal, warlike, worshipping sky gods, opposed in every way to the goddess-worshipping, peaceful farmers of the West. Modern genetic evidence has both confirmed and complicated this picture. Ancient DNA analysis, one of the most transformative new tools in archaeology, has shown definitively that there was massive migration from the Pontic-Caspian steppe into Europe beginning around 3000 BCE. The genetic signature of the Yamnaya people and their descendants, whom archaeologists call the corded ware culture in Europe, is present in significant proportions in virtually all modern European populations outside Sardinia. This migration was real, and it was massive. But, and this is crucial, the timing is slightly off for a simple steppe nomads killed the Cucuteni Trypillia narrative. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites began declining and were being abandoned by around 3500 to 3000 BCE. The major genetic influx from the steppe into the western part of the Cucuteni Trypillia territory seems to come somewhat later, after the megasites were already being abandoned. Moreover, the ancient DNA from Cucuteni Trypillia sites themselves shows evidence of contact and intermarriage with steppe peoples during the culture's later phases. It wasn't a clean boundary between us and them, but a complex zone of interaction, exchange, intermarriage, and sometimes conflict. The steppe Cucuteni Trypillia frontier was dynamic. In some periods and some areas, there seems to have been relatively peaceful coexistence and exchange. In others, there was clearly conflict. The fortification evidence at some late Cucuteni Trypillia sites suggests that steppe raiders were a real threat. But it's probably an oversimplification to blame the end of the Cucuteni Trypillia culture on a simple barbarian invasion. The truth, as so often, is more complicated. Around 3500 BCE, something began to change in the Cucuteni Trypillia world. The megasites, those astonishing urban agglomerations of tens of thousands of people, began to shrink and eventually to disappear. The culture didn't vanish overnight. It persisted in smaller, dispersed settlements for another 500 years or more. But the era of the megasites was over. Why? This is, once again, a question where we have multiple competing answers, and probably several factors that all played a role simultaneously. Climate change. Around 3500 to 3000 BCE, the climate of the Pontic-Caspian region was changing. The warm, wet conditions of the Atlantic period, roughly 5500 to 3500 BCE, which had helped make the forest steppe zone of Ukraine so extraordinarily productive, were giving way to cooler, drier conditions. The grassland was advancing at the expense of forest. The Chernozem soils, already under pressure from intensive farming, were becoming more prone to drought. We have evidence from palynology, the study of ancient pollen preserved in lake sediments, that the landscape around the megasites was dramatically transformed during the period of their occupation. Forests were cleared. The natural vegetation mosaic was replaced by open, farmed landscape. This kind of intensive land use can drive long-term soil degradation. By the time the megasites were being abandoned, the land around them may have been significantly less productive than it had been when they were first established. The agricultural surplus that made megasite living possible may have been shrinking. Population stress. Tens of thousands of people living in close quarters create stress on resources, on social relationships, on sanitation. Even with the periodic burning and relocation of the settlement itself, the surrounding landscape would have been under enormous agricultural pressure. Food production would have had to increase continuously to feed a growing population. Water sources would have been stressed. Disease would have been a constant threat, as it is in any dense pre-modern settlement. Modern epidemiological modeling suggests that settlements of the size of Talianki or Majdanetske would have been at significant risk from epidemic disease, particularly with the advent of a new zoonotic disease environment as domestic animal herding brought people into close, sustained contact with cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. Plague, in particular, appears in the ancient DNA record of Eurasia around this time. The steppe factor revisited. Even if the steppe nomads were not the primary cause of Cucuteni Trypillia collapse, they were certainly a significant stress. As the Yamnaya and related cultures became more powerful and more mobile on the steppe to the eastern frontier of the Cucuteni Trypillia territory became increasingly dangerous. The fortification evidence at late sites suggests that raiding was intensifying. Some communities may have been destroyed or abandoned due to direct violence. Others may have dispersed preemptively, breaking up the megasite concentrations to create smaller, more defensible, more mobile communities less vulnerable to nomadic raiding. Internal social stresses. It's possible that the very scale of the megasites eventually exceeded the social and organizational capacity of a culture without writing, without a formal state apparatus, without professional administrators. Managing a community of 15,000 people through consensus and kinship networks is an extraordinary achievement, but it may have been inherently unstable over long time horizons. Factionalism, resource competition, the slow accumulation of social inequality that the burning cycles may have been designed to prevent, all of these could have eroded the social cohesion that made megasite life possible. The most likely answer is that all of these factors intersected and reinforced each other. Climate deterioration reduced agricultural yields, population pressure stressed resources, disease swept through dense settlements, steppe raiding increased. Social tensions, perhaps suppressed for centuries by the renewal cycle of burning and rebuilding, may have become harder to contain. The megasites dissolved, their populations dispersed. Some communities moved west, contributing their genetic and cultural heritage to the peoples of Central Europe. Some moved south into the Balkans. Some stayed and were absorbed into the expanding steppe world. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture as a distinct archaeological entity disappears from the record by around 2700 to 2500 BCE. But the people didn't disappear. They went somewhere. Their genes are in European populations today. Their pottery techniques influence cultures across the continent. Their ideas about farming, about community, about the relationship between building and burning, between life and renewal, may have echoed through the cultures that followed them in ways we are only beginning to understand. What did the Cucuteni Trypillia people leave behind? And why does it matter 6,000 years later in a world that has almost entirely forgotten them? Let me start with the most immediate and literal legacy, their genetic contribution to modern Europeans. Ancient DNA analysis has shown that the Cucuteni Trypillia people were primarily descended from two groups. Anatolian farmers, the population that had spread agriculture into Europe from the Near East, with a smaller component of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. This is the typical profile for early European farmers. Their genetic descendants are part of the population pool from which modern Europeans derive. The dispersal of Cucuteni Trypillia communities during and after the collapse contributed to the gene pool of Central and Eastern Europe in ways that persist, in small measure, to this day. Modern Ukrainians, Romanians, Moldovans, and many other European populations carry some proportion of Cucuteni Trypillia ancestry. But the more interesting legacy is cultural and archaeological. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture represents, at its peak, the most densely populated and most organizationally sophisticated society in prehistoric Europe. They demonstrated that large-scale human organization was possible in Europe thousands of years before the Iron Age, before the Bronze Age, before the European civilizations of the classical world that we still take as our cultural reference points. They demonstrated it without writing. Without metal weapons, without states, without kings. That's remarkable. That should change how we think about human social possibilities. Because the standard story of human progress tends to go like this. Small bands of hunter-gatherers, to small farming villages, to complex chiefdoms, to early states with kings and writing, to civilization. Each step requires the previous one. You can't have a city without a king to organize it. You can't have complex society without hierarchy. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites say, maybe not. Maybe human beings are more flexible, more creative, more capable of self-organization than that story suggests. Maybe the path from small villages to large communities doesn't require passing through monarchy and hierarchy. Maybe there have been other ways of doing it, ways that were tried, that worked for centuries, that then ended, and that were then forgotten so completely that we convinced ourselves they never existed. There's also the cultural legacy, the pottery, the artistic traditions, the spiritual practices that influenced neighboring cultures. Elements of the Cucuteni Trypillia decorative tradition appear in the pottery of later cultures in the same region. The symbolism of the spiral, which is so central to Cucuteni Trypillia art, appears in cultures across Europe, in megalithic art at Newgrange in Ireland, in the carved stones of Malta, in the pottery of the Aegean. Are these connections or coincidences? The spiral is, as I mentioned, a universal natural form, but the specific ways in which it's used, the contexts in which it appears, these suggest at least the possibility of cultural diffusion, of ideas traveling along trade routes. And then there's the question of what the Cucuteni Trypillia people might teach us about our present moment. I want to be careful here, because it's very easy to romanticize the past, to project onto ancient peoples the ideals and aspirations we wish the present would embody. The Cucuteni Trypillia people were not utopians. They weren't creating a perfect society that we moderns have foolishly abandoned. They had their own conflicts, their own inequalities, their own problems. We've seen evidence of violence. We've seen evidence of resource depletion. They went through a collapse. But their example is valuable precisely because it happened. It's not a thought experiment or a political fantasy. Actual human beings, with bodies and brains like ours, actually organized themselves into communities of tens of thousands, without kings, without armies, so far as we know, without writing, without formal states, and they did it for 1,500 years. Whatever mechanisms they used, whatever forms of social organization, conflict resolution, resource sharing, and collective decision-making sustained those megasites through century after century, they were real mechanisms that real humans actually used successfully. We don't know what those mechanisms were. We can't transplant them into the present even if we did. The Cucuteni Trypillia world was utterly different from ours in almost every respect. But the fact that those mechanisms existed, the fact that the story is true, expands the space of what we know to be possible for human beings. And that expansion matters. It matters for how we think about governance, about community, about the relationship between individual and collective, about what civilization can mean. Let me spend some time on the science, because the story of how we've come to know what we know about Cucuteni Trypillia is as fascinating as the culture itself, and because understanding the methods helps you evaluate the evidence for yourself. Magnetometry. The single most transformative tool for Cucuteni Trypillia research in recent decades has been magnetometry. It works like this. Buried structures, particularly burned clay structures, have different magnetic properties from the surrounding soil. By dragging a sensitive magnetometer across a field in systematic transects, researchers can detect those magnetic anomalies and map them. Modern processing software can then convert the raw data into images that look remarkably like architectural plans. The magnetometry surveys of Ukrainian megasites, conducted primarily by German-Ukrainian research teams beginning in the 1990s and 2000s, have revolutionized the field. Before magnetometry, researchers had to extrapolate the size and layout of megasites from limited excavations, essentially guessing at the whole from a few sampled parts. After magnetometry, they could see the entire settlement plan. Every house, every pathway, every open space, mapped without turning a single spadeful of earth. The results have repeatedly stunned researchers. Sites that previous excavation had suggested were modest in size turned out, under magnetometry, to be enormous. The scale of the megasites wasn't fully appreciated until these surveys revealed their true extent. Ancient DNA. Ancient DNA. A DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of prehistoric population movements, kinship structures, and genetic heritage. By extracting and sequencing DNA from ancient skeletal remains, particularly from teeth and the dense petrous bone of the inner ear, which preserves DNA exceptionally well, researchers can determine the genetic profiles of ancient individuals. For Cucuteni Trypillia, a DNA research has revealed the ancestry of these people was primarily Anatolian Neolithic, the farming populations that spread from the Near East. There is evidence of genetic continuity within settlement phases and some evidence of interregional movement. Later phases show increasing genetic admixture with steppe ancestry populations, suggesting contact and intermarriage with the Yamnaya-related peoples to the east. The collapse of the megasites coincides with increasing steppe ancestry admixture in the archaeological record, though the causal relationship is still debated. A DNA also allows us to study kinship patterns, who was buried near whom, whether families were living together, whether settlement populations were endogamous, marrying within the group, or exogamous, marrying outside. Early results for Cucuteni Trypillia sites suggest both patterns occurred. Isotope analysis. By analyzing stable isotopes of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium in human and animal bones, researchers can reconstruct ancient diets, migration patterns, and agricultural practices. Strontium isotope analysis is particularly valuable for identifying migrants. Strontium ratios in bones and teeth reflect the geology of the area where a person lived during childhood, because strontium from local soils enters the food chain and gets incorporated into growing bones and teeth. By comparing the strontium signature of an individual's teeth, which form in childhood and don't change, with that of the local geology, researchers can tell whether someone was a local or had moved from elsewhere. For Cucuteni Trypillia, isotope studies are beginning to reveal patterns of mobility, people moving between settlements, perhaps following the periodic relocation that the burning cycle necessitated, that are consistent with the coalition model of megasite organization. Radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating, using the known decay rate of the radioactive carbon-14 isotope, allows researchers to date organic materials, charred wood, seeds, bone, with reasonable precision. For Cucuteni Trypillia, radiocarbon dating has been essential for establishing the chronology of the culture and the sequences of settlement. Modern Bayesian approaches to radiocarbon dating, which incorporate multiple dates from the same context and use statistical modeling to refine estimates, have significantly improved the precision of Cucuteni Trypillia chronology in recent years. Palynology and environmental reconstruction. By analyzing pollen preserved in lake sediments, peat bogs, and other waterlogged contexts near Cucuteni Trypillia sites, researchers can reconstruct the vegetation history of the landscape, and thus the agricultural impact of these settlements. The palynological record around megasites typically shows a dramatic reduction in tree pollen, indicating forest clearance, and an increase in grass, weed, and cereal pollen, indicating farming, during the period of occupation. After the abandonment of the megasites, some records show forest regeneration, suggesting the landscape was beginning to recover. This evidence is important for understanding both the agricultural capacity of the region and the potential for soil exhaustion as a driver of settlement relocation and eventual collapse. I want to take a moment to lay out the major debates that are actively ongoing in Cucuteni Trypillia scholarship, because I think it's important to convey that this is a living field, not a settled body of knowledge, but an ongoing investigation where smart, careful, dedicated researchers sometimes disagree quite strongly. Debate 1. Were the megasites really cities? As I discussed earlier, this is partly a definitional argument, but it's also a substantive one. The scholars who prefer megasite over city aren't just being linguistically precise. They're arguing that the social and political organization of these settlements was qualitatively different from what we find in the urban centers of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. No writing means no administration in the conventional sense. No palace means no centralized political authority in the conventional sense. The counter-argument is that this definition is Mesopotamia-centric and might exclude other valid forms of urbanism. The debate pushes us toward deeper questions about what we mean by complexity, hierarchy, and civilization. Debate 2. How egalitarian were they? The question of social hierarchy is genuinely unresolved. The burial evidence is suggestive of relative egalitarianism, but the argument from absence is weak. The assembly house at Nebelivka suggests some form of communal decision-making, but it doesn't tell us whether that decision-making was truly participatory or dominated by specific high-status individuals. Some researchers argue that kinship-based hierarchy, where elder males or specific lineages have authority, is nearly universal in human societies of this scale and complexity, and that its absence in the Cucuteni Trypillia case would be exceptional. Others argue that the evidence, particularly the burning cycle, is best explained by mechanisms specifically designed to prevent hierarchy. Debate 3. Why did they burn? As we covered in detail earlier, this remains the central mystery. New excavations and analyses continue to generate data that can be used to support or challenge each of the main theories. The jury is still very much out. Debate 4. What caused the collapse? Climate change, population stress, step pressure, or internal social contradictions? Probably all of the above in some combination, but which was most important and in what sequence is actively contested. Debate 5. Who were the Cucuteni Trypillia people in terms of language and ethnicity? This is perhaps the most politically charged debate. What language or languages did they speak? Who are their modern descendants in terms of cultural or linguistic heritage? Modern genetics has shown that the Cucuteni Trypillia people were largely replaced, in genetic terms, by steppe ancestry populations over the course of the 3rd millennium BCE. The Proto-Indo-European languages that would eventually give rise to most modern European languages probably spread with that steppe ancestry. If so, the Cucuteni Trypillia people probably spoke a language, or languages, that is not ancestral to any modern European language family, a lost language that vanished with the culture. This has political implications. Various nationalist movements, particularly in Romania and Ukraine, have at times claimed the Cucuteni Trypillia people as direct cultural ancestors. The genetic and linguistic evidence suggests these claims should be made carefully and with significant qualification. Modern Ukrainians and Romanians have some Cucuteni Trypillia genetic ancestry, but they also have substantial steppe ancestry, Anatolian farmer ancestry, and Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. And their languages are descended from Indo-European, not from whatever the Cucuteni Trypillia people spoke. Heritage is real and meaningful, but it's also complicated. The Cucuteni Trypillia people belong to the human heritage, not exclusively to any modern nation. If you want to encounter the Cucuteni Trypillia culture directly, there are several places where you can do so. In Romania, the most important institution is the National Museum of Romanian History in Bucharest, which has an excellent collection of Cucuteni pottery and figurines. There is also a dedicated Cucuteni museum at Piatra Neamț in northeastern Romania, near the original Cucuteni excavation sites. The museum has been rebuilt and expanded in recent years, and includes both original artifacts and reconstructions. The sites themselves, the village of Cucuteni and nearby Hăbășești, can be visited, though there's not much visible above ground without a trained eye. In Moldova, the National Museum of History of Moldova in Chișinău has important collections from Cucuteni Trypillia sites in Moldovan territory. In Ukraine, the situation is obviously more complex, given the ongoing war. But the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in Kyiv has significant collections, and several regional museums in central Ukraine house important materials from the megasites. The Institute of Archaeology of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine has been the lead institution for research on the megasites and has produced much of the primary research. There is also an open-air archaeological park at Legadzin in central Ukraine, where a reconstructed Cucuteni Trypillia settlement has been created based on archaeological evidence. Whether it is currently accessible to visitors depends on circumstances beyond the scope of this video. The painted pottery itself, which is the most immediately accessible expression of this culture's artistry, can be found in museum collections across Europe, including the British Museum in London, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and various archaeological museums in Germany and Austria, reflecting the long history of Central European scholarly engagement with this culture. I want to zoom out for a moment and place the Cucuteni Trypillia culture in the broader context of what we're learning about prehistoric Europe, because this culture is not an isolated anomaly. It's part of a pattern that is increasingly visible as archaeological methods improve and the picture of the deep European past comes into sharper focus. For much of the 20th century, the standard narrative of European prehistory went something like this. There were Stone Age hunter-gatherers who were gradually replaced by, or converted into, Neolithic farmers who arrived from the Near East, bringing agriculture with them. These farmers lived in small villages and were relatively simple. Then, around 3000 to 2500 BCE, nomadic herders from the Eurasian steppe arrived, bringing the Indo-European languages and bronze metallurgy, And this steppe migration set the stage for the Bronze Age civilizations of Greece, Italy, and eventually the classical world. This narrative is not wrong exactly. The broad strokes are supported by genetic evidence, but it elides enormous complexity. It makes the Neolithic farming period of Europe, roughly 7000 to 3000 BCE, sound like a quiet, uneventful prologue to the real story that begins with the Bronze Age. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites suggest that this view is profoundly mistaken. The Neolithic period produced extraordinary social experiments across Europe. The megalith builders of Western Europe, who erected Stonehenge, Newgrange, Karnak, and thousands of other monuments, were creating some of the most ambitious architectural projects in human history, organizing enormous coordinated labor efforts without apparent centralized state authority. The Cucuteni Trypillia people were building megacities on the Pontic steppe. The Minoan palace builders were beginning their experiments in the Aegean. The Varna culture was working gold and copper at a level of sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. Prehistoric Europe was not a backwater. It was a crucible of human social experimentation, with different groups trying different solutions to the problem of how large numbers of human beings can live together. Most of those experiments ended. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites were abandoned. The megalith builders eventually stopped building. The Varna culture declined. The experiments failed or were overtaken by events, or evolved into something different. But they happened. They were real. And the fact that they happened tells us that the particular path human civilization actually took, the path through Mesopotamian city-states and Egyptian pharaohs and Roman emperors, was not the only path available, not the only thing human beings could do. Just the path that happened to persist and expand and eventually dominate the narrative. The paths not taken are also part of the human story. The experiments that didn't persist are also evidence of what we are capable of. The Cucuteni Trypillia people built cities without kings. They created beauty without writing. They organized tens of thousands of people without armies. They sustained themselves on the land for 15 centuries. They burned everything they built and rebuilt it over and over again in a cycle whose meaning we still don't fully understand. And then they were gone. Not entirely gone, their genes persist, scattered through the populations of Europe. Their pottery shards lie buried in Ukrainian soil. Their house floors, baked hard by ancient fire, wait in the dark beneath the black earth. But as a living culture, as a way of life, as a particular human answer to the question of how we should live together, gone. We began this video with a question. Why has almost no one heard of the Cucuteni Trypillia culture? I think the answer has several layers. The first layer is geographic and political. This is the history of a region, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc, that was, for much of the 20th century, physically and intellectually inaccessible to much of the world. The research was conducted in Russian and Ukrainian. The museums were in Kyiv and Bucharest and Chisinau. The sites were behind the Iron Curtain. Western popular culture and Western popular history largely ignored it. The second layer is the absence of visible monuments. You cannot photograph the Cucuteni Trypillia culture the way you can photograph the pyramids. The megasites are invisible from the ground, just empty fields. The great houses burned to ash and clay thousands of years ago. What survives is pottery in museums and crop marks in aerial photographs. This is not the stuff of viral documentaries and tourist selfies. The third layer is the absence of written records. The Cucuteni Trypillia people left no inscriptions, no kings' lists, no chronicles of their deeds. History, as most people understand it, is a story told in words. Peoples who left no words are pushed to the margins, treated as background to the real story being told in Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece. And the fourth layer, perhaps the most insidious, is the way we have constructed the very concept of civilization to exclude them. If civilization requires writing, they weren't civilized. If civilization requires a state, they weren't civilized. If civilization requires monumental stone architecture, they weren't civilized. But by what right do we define civilization in those terms? By whose authority? The definitions we use reflect the particular path that particular civilizations happened to take, the path through Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece. Other paths are made invisible by those definitions. Other achievements are erased. The Cucuteni Trypillia people built some of the largest human communities the world had ever seen, at a time when most of the world still lived in small, scattered villages. They created pottery of extraordinary beauty that was widely traded across a continent. They developed agricultural systems sophisticated enough to sustain populations of tens of thousands. They organized complex communities over vast areas without a single king or bureaucrat we can identify. And they maintained this way of life across generations and centuries for longer than the Roman Empire lasted. That is civilization, different from what we usually mean by the word, but civilization. Their story deserves to be told. Their achievements deserve to be recognized. Their choices, including the extraordinary choice to burn everything they built and begin again, deserve to be contemplated. Because they were not just prehistoric people. They were not just anonymous makers of pretty pots. They were human beings grappling with the same fundamental questions that human beings have always grappled with. How do we live together? How do we share the land? How do we create beauty? How do we honor the dead and welcome the new? How do we build something worth having? How do we let go? They found their own answers to those questions. Their answers are buried now, deep in the black soil of Ukraine, beneath the empty fields where their cities once stood. But we are finding them. Piece by piece, season by season, the archaeologists are bringing it back. The forgotten mega-civilization of prehistoric Europe is being remembered, and it is extraordinary. If this video changed how you think about ancient history, if the Cucuteni Trypillia people are now in your mental map of the ancient world, please share it. This culture deserves more attention than it gets, and every person who watches this video is one more person who knows that the story of humanity is bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than we usually tell it. For sources and further reading, I've put together a detailed list in the description below. I'd especially recommend the work of John Chapman and Baserka Gajdarska on Nebelivka, the volume The Oxford Handbook of the Archaeology of Death and Burial, and Phi, for the broader theoretical questions, David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, which devotes significant attention to the Cucuteni Trypillia culture. Next time, we're going to look at another forgotten civilization that challenges everything we think we know about the ancient world. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep asking questions, keep digging. The past is deeper than you think.